Good morning. It's very good to welcome Professor Noam Lubell and Dara Murray and Georgia Hines. We're looking at you remotely. I take it you're probably in Geneva, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
Very good. Well, we'll move around the committee covering particular areas of interest, but obviously members are free to pursue follow-ups, and if you want to add to answers later on, you're free to do that. The session this morning is being webcast, and a transcript will be taken, which you can check for factual accuracy. We are planned to go on till about noon, but let's just see how we go. And if I can begin by saying, because this is our first public session at which the House requires us to declare any interests we may have. Mine is quite remote, but one of my sons-in-law, as a consultant, has done work for the ICRC. So that I put that on the record. Let me begin by asking you, I suppose, a $64,000 question, which is, how do you define AWS, and why is it important to do so?
Well, it's an interesting question in that I'm not entirely convinced we should be defining them for the purposes of these debates. We can. There are lots of different definitions, and sometimes allied states end up having different definitions themselves, which is part of the problem. I think there are four reasons I would actually say we maybe should not be rushing to define them. The first is I think it's very difficult to have a definition that wouldn't include existing systems and systems that have been in use for decades. All sorts of active radar homing or high-speed anti-radiation missiles that have been in use since the 80s would actually fit a lot of the definitions that are being bandied about right now, which would complicate things. I think also the definitions tend to place too much emphasis on autonomy rather than the artificial intelligence elements. And autonomy doesn't equate with an intelligent system. You could have dumb autonomy. You could argue that a landmine is a form of an autonomous system, but our concerns aren't really so much with the autonomy as they are with the AI that's driving a lot of these systems. And you could equally have an AI-driven system that is not entirely autonomous, that is supervised, but raises all the same problems that I think we want to discuss. So I think it's the AI is more important than the autonomy. The third reason I'd say is that autonomy is a characteristic applied to just one function within a system. So the system might not be classed as autonomous, but it still may have autonomous functions. And again, I think that makes it difficult to just say a system is autonomous. And the last point I'd make on this is that we're talking about a very fast-paced field where things are changing all the time, and any definition we tried to come up with now, if we made a hard and fast definition, we'd have all sorts of systems that fall outside of it within probably a very short time frame. So I think at the end of the day, we need to be focusing on particular characteristics of systems, but and look at the how they apply to different functions of the systems. But I'm not sure that sort of trying to define autonomous systems as a whole and then apply everything to that is the right way to go forward.
Is the logic of what you're saying that if we've got this rather sort of leaky set of definitions of AWS and autonomy, that actually in order to arrive at a working definition which will be reasonably robust against developments, we need to have a much more constraining concept of what AWS is or are?
So I think rather than trying to sort of have these specific definitions, I think we need to come up with basic principles, guidelines, and rules that apply to whatever systems we use, regardless of how we define them. I think that would be the way to go, and also to keep in mind that, and again, the definitions keep talking about weapons, but some of the concerns might not be with the targeting element of these systems. It could be with earlier stages in the targeting cycle, with identification of objects and so on. So again, I would much prefer that we spoke about particular characteristics, problems that come up with AI, and apply them across the targeting cycle rather than try and sort of talk about autonomous weapon systems as a thing.
Thank you very much. Can I bring in Dara Murray and Georgia Hines and then look to Lord Grocott for a supplementary?
Of course, I shouldn't have let Noam go first. I agree very, very closely. I think my main concern with the definitions I've seen of autonomous systems is that they're potentially overly narrow. So if we think of the targeting cycle as the identification, the selection and the engagement of a target, often when we think of autonomous weapon systems, they do all three components. So you think of something like a drone that's deployed to the battlefield, to identify enemy tanks and engage them. That tends to be what we think of when we think of an autonomous weapon system. But as I think Noam was talking about, in the future, well, particularly in the future, the military is going to be an interconnected military with lots of different sensors drawing on a wide variety of data points, data sources, and that's going to be characterized by pervasive AI across that entire system. So one of the things that will inevitably arise is that AI may be used to identify a target, to draw on intelligence and identify it. That will then be passed to a targeting matrix and then selected for engagement. But the only autonomous component might be an identification, entirely separate. It's a normal fighter jet that attacks the target. So I think avoiding an overly narrow definition is really, really important.
Thank you. Georgia Hines.
Thanks very much. So on this, the ICRC has put forward a definition, including in the CCW, and that's been picked up by a number of states and aligns quite closely with proposals by the UK. So the definition that we put forward is a weapon system that selects and applies force to targets without human intervention. So I think I agree with the comments that have been made that it's definitely appropriate to take a functional approach. So we're basing it on the process by which the force is applied rather than tying it to technological specifics. And I agree with both what's been said and with the UK government's position that tying definitions to technology would absolutely risk them becoming redundant very quickly. I think for us, our definition does extend to cover certain existing weapons, so things like air defence systems on warships, active protection weapons on tanks, and a mine would fit our definition as a very rudimentary autonomous weapon system. And I think this demonstrates that for us, the definition doesn't require complex technology. So it is not a defining feature that an AWS incorporate AI. It might, but it doesn't necessarily. The key point for us, and what raises the most concerns from a legal and an ethical perspective, is that after the weapon system is activated by a person, then it's the system that self-initiates or triggers a strike or application of force, and it does this responding to environmental information. So it receives this through its sensors, and it has a generalized target profile that's been input at the activation stage. The difficulty there for us, and what is at the root of most of our legal and ethical concerns, is that the user isn't choosing or doesn't even absolutely know the specific target, the precise timing, the location of that force application. And for us, this makes a really fundamental difference between an AWS and some of these other types of AI-enabled systems, so something like an AI-enabled decision support system that is just providing intelligence information or something that then feeds into the targeting cycle, but it doesn't displace those critical functions of selecting and attacking the target. So I think that where I suppose I would differ is that, firstly, I don't think it's problematic that our definition captures current examples, because there's sort of two definitions that need to occur. Firstly, you capture all systems, all autonomous systems that may raise humanitarian concerns and that need to be regulated. So that's based on this idea of them selecting and attacking targets, which is very, very different from these non-autonomous systems. And then within that, you have the definition of certain types of autonomous weapon systems that might require specific prohibitions. So for us, then we move to the smaller category of, well, unpredictable autonomous weapon systems, ones that don't allow humans to control and limit their effects. That would be a category of prohibition for us. or autonomous weapon systems that are designed and used to apply force against persons. But all the other ones that are currently within use that don't fall within those smaller prohibited categories, I think are subject to general regulations, constraints on use that are already being input around duration, location, the types of targets. They're primarily being used only against military objectives by nature, so things like incoming projectiles, enemy equipment, things that are much more stable in their characterization, rather than sort of, civilian objects that might be used temporarily. So say a hospital is used temporarily as a base.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you to keep your answers fairly short, because we've got quite a lot of ground to cover, and when we can pick up that issue of regulation and constraint in a moment, because I know that Lord Clement Jones has got some questions on that. Lord Grocott.
It's been covered.
Oh,
I was going to ask you. Yes, very much so.
In that case, on this, Lord Brown.
Specifically on this. So since I haven't spoken, I'll go through my interests. So I'm the vice chair of and a consultant to the Nuclear Threat Initiative. I'm a director of both the European Leadership Network and the Asia Pacific Leadership Network that work on arms control matters. A member of what, to my embarrassment, is called the Group of Eminent Persons of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty Organisation, and a member of the top-level Group for Multilateral Nuclear Disarmament and Non-Proliferation, and I'm very proud to be an ambassador of the Halo Trust. So, on this issue of definition, first of all, as an observation, we have to have a starting point. I think it's very clear from what we've been doing in preparing for this, that the issues that we are concerned about are pretty clear, and they are highlighted, I think, by Ms. Hines' evidence to us. So if we don't start with some definition, because we're all legislators, then where do we start? So, and if we come into an environment in which, the US Department of Defence, NATO, Human Rights Watch, the International Commission for Red Cross all have definitions, we can't just ignore them. So we need some assistance as to where we start with this. And I put this in the form of a question. Is it not sensible for us to start where everybody else is, which is struggling to find a definition?
Professor Lubell, I'll give you first crack at that.
So I'm not sure there is a place where everybody else is. There are different definitions out there. We've even seen at times between the US and the UK significant differences, to the point that one is saying we use them but only with human supervision, and the other saying we don't have them and we would never use them, talking about the same systems. Now that has changed, and the definitions of including the US and the UK have developed with time. But I would say that one can certainly talk about the use of, and again, I wouldn't limit it to weapons. I would say the use of AI in a targeting cycle, use of AI in military operations. I would have something around that as my starting point, rather than defining particular weapon systems, because, and I think this came out with actually all of the comments, artificial intelligence can play a critical role in who or what ends up being targeted, even outside of a particular weapon. And there's actually a risk, if what you're concerned about, I would say, is some of the dangers that could happen. Actually using some of these definitions that are out there could actually limit the ability to address some of these concerns.
Darrell Murray, are you in agreement with that?
Yeah, I am. I think the danger with the current focus with the definition is that it focuses tension on something that's kind of quite sensational. I guess, it's the Terminator-style autonomous weapon system that gets deployed and selects targets and engages on its own. And maybe that's only a very small subset of potential systems, and as Noam was saying, it's the use of AI across the military that's maybe of more concern. So the danger with the current definition, I think, is that it just misses an awful lot of really important issues.
Let me go to the Bishop of Coventry before I ask Ms. Hines for her view on that.
Christopher Cox, the Bishop of Coventry. I can't think of any relevant interest that I have to declare. I think my question is simply whether this more sophisticated concept of definition that you're talking about, does that provide the sort of basis that international law can work with in the way that Georgina Hines was suggesting is needed at some point, both in terms of regulation or even prohibition? Is not some sort of fairly well-defined, agreed definition necessary for lawmakers?
It depends what you want to apply it to. I think if you're trying to create a new legal instrument, for example, that applies to a particular category of, say, weapons, then absolutely you have to define them. And any instrument that's dedicated to a particular set of weapons, has some form of a definition. But and I would suggest perhaps the more practical help us going into the future. If what you're trying to do is to say, well, these are the types of technologies that are now being used, we need to clarify certain aspects of international law, and in particular international humanitarian law, that would apply to any weapons system. It will apply to all. They'll apply to all, however you define autonomous weapon systems, and other things as well. These particular rules need to be clarified in terms of what level of human involvement, human supervision do you need? And, there's no problem saying it applies to other weapons that aren't AI weapons that fit outside of this definition as well, because these should be things that apply across the board. So my starting point would be to say, these are the technologies that are coming out. This is how they're going to be used. Let's clarify international law to make sure that the existing principles and rules are understood in a way that we can use them in these weapons and address the concerns that come up with these weapons, but they would apply across the board. They don't require us to come up with a specific, narrow definition right now of autonomous weapon systems.
Can I just ask Georgia Hines if she wants to comment on that? Then I'll go to Lord Cameron and then Lord Horton.
Thanks very much. So I do think this issue about there is definitely a risk with definitions that are too narrow, and I think we need to be mindful of that in the sense that then any prohibitions, any regulations that are developed, even any policies, wouldn't have a meaningful impact in addressing the very real humanitarian and legal and ethical concerns. And I think we've seen that with some notions like fully autonomous weapon systems or autonomous weapon systems completely outside human control. They definitely seem to run this risk of, I think, what was referred to as this fantastical Terminator scenario. But we very much support the idea of a baseline definition from which to then build on, recognising that we do call for new rules rather than simply a clarification of existing IHL. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you. To Lord Fairfax of Cameron, with apologies for having misnamed him earlier on.
I'm often called Lord Halifax, so that's a change. Thank you. So I just want, first of all, may I declare I have one interest. I'm the co-owner of a private security company called Hawkeye Worldwide Limited. But I've got quite a narrow question, actually. I was just picking up on your point about targeting. And I was just thinking of the scenario where you have, the targeting is done by AI, and then there's a human in the loop afterwards. So, so in that scenario, so the AI says, we're good to go, but it's then for a human to decide whether to accept that recommendation. So would that fall out of, therefore, the consent? Because you were very much talking about targeting, and I was just thinking about that situation where, after the recommendation from the AI, you have the human making the actual decision.
Professor Lubell.
Yes, I mean, I think this is something, I don't know if you're planning to run through all the questions, it's something that comes up also later with regard to one of the questions of some of the problems that may arise. But just briefly, I'd say there is a real issue over understanding what we mean by human involvement. I mean, there are different phrases used: human in the loop, human on the loop. By the way, if you're thinking about future technologies, we including in the UK and the US, people are working on brain-computer interfaces that place human in the loop, physically plugged into the system. I mean, these things are happening, and is that enough or not? Where do you place the human? And this is something that the MOD has spoken about, context-appropriate human involvement. So at what stage does that come? Do you need a human at every stage or not? I think this is a theme that's probably going to come up quite a bit in our next discussion, but it's absolutely something that one needs to be aware of. Where is the human placed? Will the human automatically trust the system? There are deep sociological, psychological, and other aspects around that as well.
May I have a follow-up question? And it's a bit of an odd one, perhaps. But I'm just thinking of the self-driving situation. Big issue at the moment. Whether you have robo-cars, and I wonder whether this is applicable at all to the situation that we're considering. So it is thought that robo-cars may, in fact, be much safer than cars driven by humans. They may reduce the accident rate to, I don't know, a fraction of 1% rather than whatever it is at the moment. But the fact that they are driven by artificial intelligence means that we humans expect them to be 100%. I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to say. And I'm just wondering whether that analogy is at all applicable to our scenario, where you may have, it may be the fact that it's an AI deciding in the end whether to push the button or not is unacceptable, whereas in fact, let's say the casualty rate or the risk of bad decisions may in fact be much smaller.
Sure, yeah, I think the fact that it is an AI is probably at the crux of the heart of the issue, and I think maybe that's the ICRC's objection to the idea that the AI targets individuals. I don't think from a legal standpoint that there is necessarily a distinction. Somebody is targeted legally, it's whether it's in compliance with IHL or not. And I think there is a possibility that AI could produce far better results. It can take a lot more information into account. It doesn't suffer from fatigue or from adrenaline or from revenge. So if it's designed properly, I don't see why it couldn't be better in some instances. I think for me, the big stumbling block is that we tend to approach an AI system kind of from a one-size-fits-all perspective, where we expect it to do everything. But if we break it down in certain situations, maybe identifying an enemy tank or responding to an incoming rocket, an AI system might be much better.
Georgia Hines, do you want to come in on that?
I will, thank you. So I think this comes up a lot about the potential for autonomous weapon systems to improve compliance with IHL. And definitely I understand that autonomous weapons can offer potential military benefits over direct control or remotely controlled. And so the increased speed, operation in communication denied environments. But I think, first of all, we'd be very much caution against conflating potential military benefits with IHL compliance or humanitarian compliance. Now, something like speed actually can pose a real risk for compliance with IHL. So if human operators don't have the actual ability to monitor and to intervene in processes, if they're accelerated beyond human cognition, it means that they wouldn't be able to prevent an unlawful or an unnecessary attack. And that's actually an IHL requirement. I think this point about the fact that artificial intelligence or autonomous systems are not subject to rage and revenge and fatigue. First of all, the argument, like with self-driving cars at the moment, actually lacks empirical evidence. Instead, what we're doing is engaging in hypotheticals where we compare a bad decision by a human operator against a hypothetically good outcome that results from a machine process. And I think there are many assumptions made in this argument, not least of which is that humans necessarily make bad decisions. It ultimately also ignores the fact that humans are vested with the responsibility for complying with IHL. So they are the ones that can be held accountable if they don't, and there are processes for this. So I think there are many assumptions made in that. On the incorporation of AI into other decision support systems, so feeding into but not replacing the targeting process, I think we agree that this can bring greater information, a greater situational awareness, which could, as has been said, under the right conditions, accounting for things like automation bias, could produce good results. But again, I would make a separation between those systems that are feeding in but not replacing the ultimate human decision in targeting and autonomous weapon systems, because I think they do fundamentally raise different legal considerations.
Thank you very much. I go to Lord Horton, and then we'll move into the related question, which you touched on already, of regulation and constraint. So, Lord Horton.
Lord Horton, just in terms of my interest, a general interest in being an ex-Chief of Defence Staff, and then multiple interests, either being the chairman of or an advisor to a range of defence and security businesses which use AI in their products. And I'll just list them: Draken, Secure Cloud Plus, Thales UK, TadderWeb, Whitespace, and Rebellion Defence. My question is perhaps a bit convoluted, but does humanitarian law always proceed from the assumption that a human decision is better than a machine decision? Or is it the fact that there's always got to be the accountability of a human in the chain of delegation of a decision? And might it be a plausible scenario that a human being could delegate to an autonomous machine the deciding, the decision ability, even, and still remain liable in the event of that turning out to have been a bad choice? Can you unpick that? Where, you know, because in my experience, the battlefield is full of flawed decisions. Yes. Many of them precede arrival on the battlefield, I have to say. So to try to sort of pursue some element of perfection in all this could be a bit dancing on a pin, when for some of the reasons you've absolutely said, that the better decision, when there is a time imperative and there is no collateral risk and all that sort of, delegation is a far better option to an autonomous system. Or we forgo all the benefits of technological advancement in this particular area. Could you perhaps have a comment on any of that?
Right. Who's going to go first? Professor Lubell.
Well, there's a lot in there. Mm-hmm. So, firstly, just on sort of better decisions or not better decisions, I think it's important also to and to acknowledge, and I agree with what our colleague from the ICRC said in terms of better for whom, and the military side and the humanitarian side might not always, in this sense, see the same thing as being better. I do think that, you know, speed was mentioned, but accuracy, for example, is one where both, I think, on both sides of the equation, the military and the humanitarian, you can make an argument that accuracy is a good thing. And so, for example, if these systems are more accurate, that might be a reason. There may be a humanitarian reason to use them. But we've seen some of these debates play out, similar to the questions that are being asked now, with precision weapons that sort of emerged over the last 3 decades. And you can see that on the one hand, there's an argument being made, well, there'll be less collateral damage, you know, so it's better to use them. But at the same time, one could also argue that that also led to carrying out military strikes in situations where previously it would have been unlawful because there would be too much collateral damage. Now you carry out a strike because you feel you've got a precision weapon, and there is some collateral damage, albeit lawful, but had you not had that weapon, you wouldn't have carried out the strike at all. So sort of there's two sides to this coin. In terms of the delegating to these systems, I think part of the problem is how we discuss and debate this. So we're talking about what, and you know, I'm not the technology expert myself, but probably enough. I know enough to say that there's a difference in what I call general artificial intelligence and narrow artificial intelligence. And narrow artificial intelligence, we're talking about systems that are created to perform a particular task. They're a tool. Right? It's not the sort of the Terminator scenario of the general artificial intelligence of something that sets its own tasks and goes about achieving them. And so the systems that we're talking about don't decide, right? In that sense, we're using language that is sort of the human language for a tool. It executes a function, but it doesn't make a decision in that sense. And so I personally am not comfortable with the idea even that we're delegating anything to it. This is a tool, just like any other tool. All weapons are tools, and we're using a tool. And in that sense, from an accountability perspective, I don't know if you want us to get into the whole accountability question now or later. But
I think we will later.
Yeah, yeah. So I won't get into that, but I think there are solutions to the accountability problem that are based on understanding that these are tools rather than agents.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's really important, and I'd be also hesitant in this context of using the word delegation. I think we have to remember that humans set the parameters for deployment. So I think the tool analogy is a really important one. You know, we should be able to set the types of activities that a tool will undertake, and that's where the bounds of responsibility and facilitating IHL compliance come in. And I think thinking of it as general AI is maybe, it's what we were saying earlier, I think maybe a little bit distracting from the more likely deployments we're going to face in kind of the short to medium term.
Ms. Hines, have you got anything to add to that?
Thanks. I will add just a point on the precision argument. So again, we hear, autonomous weapon systems often equated with being more precise or more accurate. I think we struggle a little bit with this argument because the use of an autonomous weapon by its definition reduces precision because the user actually isn't choosing a specific target. They're launching a weapon that's designed to be triggered based on a generalized target profile or a category of object. I think the reference to precision here generally relates to the ability to better home in on a target and maybe to use a smaller payload, but that isn't tied specifically to the autonomous function of the weapon. So we spoke about precision guided munitions. I mean, there's nothing in our definition that is capturing those. That's to do with incorporating better guidance systems such as GPS or laser guidance. And that doesn't mean that you have autonomy in the function of selecting and attacking the target necessarily. You can have a remotely piloted system that has exactly those same precision benefits. So I think that we should be careful confusing those kinds of precision systems with necessarily what an autonomous weapon system, as I said, it could incorporate a landmine, which is definitely not a more precise weapon. On the IHL obligations and the question of what they require of individuals, there are certain IHL obligations that are specifically directed to persons. So, I mean, it's difficult to get around that. But then even more broadly, IHL assessments, fundamental assessments such as distinction, proportionality, they rely very much on value judgments and context. So when you recognise someone as surrendering, when you have to calculate proportionality, it's not a numbers game, it's about what is the military advantage anticipated. Algorithms are not good at evaluating context. They're not good at rapidly changing circumstances, and they can be what's called quite brittle. So I think in those circumstances, I would really query how we're saying that there would be a better outcome for IHL compliance when you're trying to codify qualitative assessments into quantitative code that doesn't respond well to these elements. So I'll leave it there and we can discuss the other elements.
Let me just pick up on compliance, because I'm going to bring in Lord Clement Jones on the issues of regulation and constraint, and in that context perhaps come back to Lord Brown in a moment.
Thank you very much, Chair. I declare an interest as Chair of the Council of Queen Mary University of London. I'm going to ask about the what regulations or limitations on use may be needed, but we've already seen a bit of a divergence between, in a sense, what actual problems, major concerns we're talking about, because I think there's more of an emphasis from Professor Lubell and Dr. Murray, there's more of an emphasis there on AI and more of an emphasis from Georgia Hines on autonomy, on AWS, basically. So, in a sense, I need to ask a two-part question, even in that respect. So, Georgia Hines, could you tell me what your major concerns are in respect of this technology?
Of course. So I think I've already touched on some of these legal perspective concerns, but because you do have these context-specific judgments and IHL is directed at humans, we're concerned about the ability for an autonomous weapon system to facilitate compliance of the user with their IHL obligations. IHL is about processes, not just results. So you might have an attack that in fact causes excessive incidental civilian harm, but if the commander or the decision maker went through the proportionality assessment in good faith and they used the information that they had and a reasonable commander would have made the same decision, then the attack can still be lawful even if the circumstances changed and affected the end result. So I guess what I'm saying is that it is about human judgment and it is about a reasoning process, and these can't be outsourced. We also have ethical concerns. So the concern about effectively substituting life and death decisions with a machine process. And we held an expert meeting on this in 2017 with independent ethicists and other fields. And we published a report that confirmed clear challenges around the loss of human agency in the use of force, moral responsibility and human dignity. And these are concerns that are complementary to the legal concerns, but they're actually additional to. I think they're often ignored because maybe the experts like myself are not ethicists and are perhaps a little bit uncomfortable talking about these things, but it's worth noting that ethics often drives the development of international humanitarian law and international law more broadly. So this is not a unique case that we're seeing here.
I'll come back to you about what regulations or limitations on use may be needed, but perhaps I could ask Professor Lubell the question.
Certainly, thank you. So, from a legal perspective, legal concerns, I think sometimes we're conflating technological challenges and legal ones. So the example of proportionality, for as I said, absolutely. Certainly right now, we can't envisage any AI system that can do the proportionality balance, right? So in proportionality, as I'm sure some of you know, on the one side, you're putting the concrete and direct military advantage that you anticipate, and on the other side, you're putting the collateral harm, the harm to civilians and civilian objects that can be expected. And then you balance the two. Right. So as has been said, that balancing is, at least for the time being, something that we cannot imagine a machine doing. We do have AI systems that can calculate one side of it, and they do that already. You've got all sorts of collateral damage estimation tools and so on where we use these systems, but balancing the two we leave to humans. But that's a technological challenge. I don't see that as a legal problem. The technology can't do it, so clearly it would be unlawful to use it. Right, and so I think sometimes we're sort of raising technological problems and saying there's a legal one. It's not a legal problem. Technology simply can't do it. Therefore, you can't use it for that purpose. You use it for other purposes, possibly. And I think in terms of the concerns that I would have right now, I think I think generally speaking, trying to clarify how technology is, at least in the foreseeable future, going to be used and how the existing rules apply. I think that, to me, is the way to do it. I don't see, I'm not particularly worried about the UK or like-minded states right now rushing to release systems that select and lethally engage their own targets. In that sense, but I think other states might. I think non-state actors are going to be making great strides in this field as well. I think that also means that ultimately we're going to see, and this is part of the concern, some form of an AI arms race, and partially because you may need AI to defend against AI. and any arms race can be a race to the bottom. But I think right now the concern is less about a system that you're just going to sort of release in the wild and it's going to choose what and who to attack. I still would go back to earlier comments where the way AI is used in the earlier stages of the targeting cycle in detecting and identifying, for example, objects of interest, military objects, because we know this already from the law enforcement area where my colleague here has worked quite a lot on problems of bias and other issues that have come up in using AI for law enforcement purposes. And if those problems repeat themselves when we're using AI in the earlier intelligence analysis and target and object identification stages, I think that's where we are, at least in the very near future, in terms of problems that can arise from the use of AI that we really need to keep our eye upon.
And do your concerns mirror those of Professor Lubell's, Darren Murray?
To a large degree. I think I have a couple of others. I'd endorse very much the AI life cycle, that we interrogate how AI applies across the entire life cycle rather than just focusing on one element. I'd also agree that I don't think the problems are necessarily with the law itself, but rather ensuring legal compliance and ensuring that we understand the technology and how it works and how that can match to legal requirements. And I think one of my main concerns is that how we acknowledge the characteristics of an AI system or an autonomous system, in terms of how it works. So it typically works on the basis of correlation and not causation, and essentially a probability score. So it's an inference that an object is a tank, or an inference that an individual is a member of an armed group based on a variety of different sources. And it's really understanding how those work so that we can apply them to IHL rules. That'll be key, I think. It's very value heavy, and it is context dependent. I think one of the things to acknowledge, I guess, is that that decision is made by humans at the moment, but it's also an imperfect decision. I think we've seen a lot of issues where there's been errors made, say, particularly with the classification of an individual as a member of an armed group or not. And so it's about better understanding how we can acknowledge the characteristics of an AI system or the tools and ensure legal compliance on that basis.
Thank you very much. And this is one of the big questions that we've got to try and get to grips with, but would you like to make a start, Georgia, on regulations or limitations on their use that may be needed to address your concerns and possibly those expressed by the other members of the panel as well?
I'd love to. ICRC always loves to have a go at assisting with laws and regulations. So our recommendations, and they've been made in the CCW and elsewhere, are that states adopt new law at the international level. So first of all, to prohibit certain categories of autonomous weapon systems. So the first one is unpredictable autonomous weapon systems. And what I mean by that are systems that are designed or used so their effects can't be sufficiently understood. And we've heard already about the need for understanding, but also that they can't be predicted or explained. And this is most likely to arise with those systems that are incorporating AI, particularly machine learning, and they can exhibit it's called the black box effect. I'm sure some of you are familiar, where their functioning is opaque. So because these systems don't allow the user to control or limit the effects, which is a requirement of IHL, for us, these should be prohibited. Then the next category is a prohibition against those systems that are designed or used to target humans. And this is both a legal and an ethical concern. Coming back to that complex judgment that's needed for a person in armed conflict, whether they are protected, so whether they are surrendering or whether they are hors de combat or out of the fight in some way, whether they are wounded or sick. These are very context dependent. They are things that rely on causation, on intention, and not well recognized by the machine algorithms. So they also are something that changes very rapidly. So we really struggle to see how an autonomous weapon system could be used to allow a user to comply with the IHL requirement of distinction. Picking up on Noam's point about technological changes, the other basis for this prohibition is actually ethical. And as I said before, that is something additional to the law. It is not something that can be fixed with a technological fix, because the idea of removing human agency in a life and death decision remains regardless of whether you're targeting a legitimate combatant or a protected person. So they're the two prohibited categories. And then for those that aren't prohibited, we recommend a combination of limitations on use. And I should say these actually reflect existing constraints that militaries are using. So specifically the types of targets, as I said, they're mostly used on military objectives by nature, so incoming projectiles, enemy equipment, things that are stable in their characterization. And then limits on duration, geographical scope, scale of use, so enabling a level of control over the effects, situations of use to constrain them to areas where civilians aren't present to reduce proportionality difficulties, and finally requirements for human-machine interaction. So what I mean there is about a level of human supervision, the ability to intervene and deactivate. So something like a self-deactivation of the machine is not enough. There needs to be a real ability for the human to step in if circumstances change. So this is our proposal to reinforce but also to strengthen existing IHL in light of the particular risks of autonomous weapons.
Thank you. I'm sure colleagues will want to unpack that later, but thank you. I'll start with Dara, if I may, and then come on to Professor Lebel.
Great, thanks. I fully agree that any tool that can comply with IHL should be prohibited. I think the rules of IHL are very clear on that, and that has to be the litmus test. I think the other element that I think is relatively important is focusing on the decision-making process surrounding the development of the tools. And I think we don't have a lot of guidance in that regard. You know, what are the different factors that we should take into account when we're considering the tools? And it's something a colleague mentioned earlier in terms of, you know, a lot of the focus being on the process, and so ensuring that there's an adequate process from the outset, I think, is really important, and it's something that we haven't paid sufficient attention to so far. And they're drawing on a more interdisciplinary approach, you know, really understanding the technological constraints, understanding how we ensure legal compliance, you know, what other issues should be taken into account. I think that'll be a really key component.
A mixture of prohibition and regulation, basically.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. And guidance, I think, too, in terms of... Yeah.
Do you agree with that, Professor?
So, my starting point, and it's not just in relation to this question, but whenever we're dealing with if it's new technologies or new situations, is to try and avoid saying we need new law unless it is absolutely imperative. I think one needs to keep in mind that as soon as we say that existing rules are insufficient, we're effectively admitting to a legal lacuna that could be exploited by whether it's us or others for years, and it takes years to develop new law. So I'm always very, very uneasy when we say we need new law, because what does it mean about what we've got right now? I also would tend to agree with the UK government's position that by and large existing IHL contains the basic rules that we need here. That doesn't mean that we don't need to do a lot of work to unpack and guide how it applies to particular situations. I think in terms of the categories that have been mentioned that might need new regulation, I think, you know, we talk sometimes about unpredictable, but I'm not sure if that's the test in terms of sort of, is it predictability that we need or reliability? Right, so think of existing weapon systems that are sort of loitering systems, for example, that you might release and it'll loiter in a particular area and it'll look for a certain signal, say if we're talking about attacking radar systems, and you can have a system that you know that it's going to attack a certain type of thing, but you don't know which one. You don't know which one, and you don't know if it might not find it and self-destruct. Does that mean that that system is unlawful? Or if I can tell you, I don't know exactly where it's going to attack, and I don't know the minute it's going to attack, and I don't know if it might decide to self-destruct, but I know that the only thing it can do is something lawful, and if not, it will self-destruct. So you could argue that it's not predictable in terms of I don't know, you know, exactly what it's going to do, but it's reliable. right? And so I'm not sure what essentially we're supposed to be looking for. If we're talking about unpredictability in terms of something that will just go off and target whatever it likes, then absolutely. But I'm not sure we need new laws for that. I mean, that's under a host of IHL rules, it would be unlawful to use something like that. And as far as systems that are used against humans, again, for me, this is a technological problem. I agree. The systems right now, they can't recognize, hostile intent. They can't tell the difference right now between a short soldier with a real gun and a child with a toy gun. Most systems still aren't capable of doing that. Or a wounded soldier lying slumped over their rifle versus a sniper lying on on the sniper rifle ready to shoot. They can't do that yet. But that's a technological problem, and we shouldn't use them because they can't be used lawfully. I'm not sure that it requires a new law. The ethical issue is completely separate. There are absolutely ethical questions there. If we want to create new laws because of ethical concerns, that is certainly valid, but it's not because of necessarily a legal problem. It's a choice.
Thank you.
Lord Clement-Jones, you were absolutely telepathic in your prediction of lots of supplementaries. I've got Lord Brown, then Lord Hamilton, then Lord Fairfax. And I think after that, Lord Grocott would like to explore, as it were, the mirror image of some of the constraint issues that you've been outlining. So, Lord Brown.
Thank you, Lord Chair. I mean, there's a certain irony in us having this conversation about lacuna in the law in relation to technology in this Parliament at this time, because we are about to employ almost all of our resource for about 6 months trying to catch up with the risks that we didn't engage with when we allowed technologies to be deployed into our lives. I mean, the Online Safety Bill, which is a large piece of legislation, is only one of them. There are a number of them in different areas. That way of dealing with technology and regulation has not proved to be efficient or successful, and it's caused a lot of risk. And this is one of my major concerns about the approach with respect, Professor Lubel, that you encourage on us, is that we are living now in a world in which there are lethal autonomous weapons out there. They are being used for sentry purposes by certain people, and if the evidence of the United Nations is correct, and there are UAVs that have been deployed and used that use them, and there is a kind of sense around the way in which people talk about this in this arms race in Thailand, that there is a fear of losing out, among capabilities, and there is this constant argument that comes up in arms control is, why should the bad guys have all these weapon systems? It's not only them. So, I mean, this may be a forlorn attempt to try and do this, but I think those who were keen to have this select committee are trying to find a way in which we can at least get in step with this or get ahead, and actually making the mistake of banning weapons now prematurely would be, I think, the least worst of the options. So, I mean, how do we... what we're looking for are recommendations as to how we can not make that mistake again. Entertain the risk and then find out when it manifests that it's much worse than we thought it was. So what, from a legal perspective, given that we shouldn't be showing people where the lacuna are lacuna in our legal our laws, but they know. So, what's your advice?
Please don't treat this as a 3-hour essay question.
So, part of what I think I was trying to say is that the existing law is there. A lot of the problems that have been raised, I just think are covered. A lot of the concerns are covered by existing prohibitions. So it's not, it's not to say that, these things will be, even futuristic scenarios that are brought up, I still think are covered by and large by existing rules. But as I said, if we want to try and make progress, we need to unpack these rules. The rules are very general. Right? Everything, all the rules that we talk about, really, once you try and apply them to detail, that's where things break down. And what's been happening, and my concern is, even if we talk about a new instrument, if you look at, say, just a few weeks ago, the statement by the UK, the US, and others, it included, draft articles on this subject. Now, let's say that became the law. Right? Because if you had if you had a new instrument, the phrasing would be similar. It would be at that level. It's at the higher level, right? Of you can do this, you can't do that. But it ends up using phrases like, and this is phrases that have been used by the UK of say context-appropriate human involvement. In the use of weapons, and phrases like that are used, and I think they're the correct phrases. But what does that mean? So how do you use them in this context? How do you use them in that context? What does context-appropriate human involvement mean in the identification of targets by an AI system, and systems that are already starting to be looked at, like Spotter and Squinter and others that sort of help detect objects, right? So what does context-appropriate human involvement mean there, as opposed to what does it mean for the commander deploying a system? What will it mean when we have systems that engage swarm technology? Right? There are, so I can lay out 20 different contexts, and in each one, appropriate human involvement might mean something else. Now, if we had a new instrument, it wouldn't spell all of that out. It would still stay at a relatively generalized level of what the law is in terms of whether human involvement is needed or not, but we'd still need ultimately the guidance on what that means. And so I think the high level type of things that we'd end up with in new law, I think we can find them in existing IHL. What I would urge us to do is to spend more time on unpacking this and how these things would be used in practice in the real world. And that doesn't necessarily require new law, but it requires actually a lot more work.
Dr. Murray.
Yeah, I agree. I think the danger with looking at a specific type of weapon is that we miss the bigger picture, which is the more pervasive role of AI across the military. And so I think the danger is that a lot of regulatory efforts goes on addressing a particular type of weapon, the use of which for the most part is probably banned or regulated already under IHL, and then we make the same mistake, I guess, as we've done with other areas of technology, is that we don't pay sufficient attention to it. We don't think through the future consequences by looking at the guidance and by working it out and really thinking through the decision-making process. And for me, that's the big concern, is that if we only focus on a specific type of autonomous weapon system, we aren't thinking through how intelligence is generated using AI systems, which will affect targeting further down the line, or detention issues. And I think that's the big risk, that we kind of get distracted.
Georgia Hines, do you have anything to add before I bring in Lord Hamilton?
Just quickly on this issue of why we're calling for new law, because we do agree that existing IHL rules apply to autonomous weapons, and they already do constrain the use, and they would prohibit certain types, in particular inherently indiscriminate. And the ICRC does not often call for new international rules for precisely the reason that Noam has identified, and we don't do it lightly. But I think we only have to look at the debates in the CCW, which have been going on for nearly 10 years, and we can see that states can and they do hold different views about precisely what are the limits and requirements for the design and use of autonomous weapons that flow from existing IHL. And I don't think this is surprising, because in every IHL expert discussion that we have, there's always points of difference about not only the application of different treaty obligations across states, because you have that, but in the precise interpretation of commonly applicable key obligations. And this is not something that we can hope to solve in a forum like the CCW. In fact, we're wary of trying to do that, because attempts to restate or reinterpret existing rules risk leading to sort of lowest common denominator, less protective formulations. So actually, the fact that we don't have consensus on how the rules apply specifically to autonomous weapons is, for us, what makes it clear that we need something specific. We need something that is shared and codified to provide that understanding and clarity. So I think that's our rationale there.
Thank you very much. Lord Hamilton.
Thank you, Lord Chairman. I'm a shareholder in the Herald Investment Trust, which apparently invests in technology companies. I have no idea what they are. And I'm a vice patron of the Defence Forum. My question is really for Georgia Hines, because we're talking here about new laws which should be signed up to by Western civilized countries, but Professor Lubell's already referred to hostile actors. Let's sort of put a name to hostile actor, Russia and Vladimir Putin. He doesn't seem to be lying awake at night worrying too much about international treaties and whether he's abiding by them. And if we were to go to war with Russia, surely we would be at a distinct disadvantage that he would be using all these illegal systems against us, and we would have nothing to play back to him. Does it not worry you that we would be putting troops in the ground at a distinct disadvantage to the enemy that we were fighting?
So I think, this argument comes up a lot when we talk about international humanitarian law, but at the same time, it doesn't stop countries like the UK from very clearly committing to abiding by and following IHL. And it's not based on reciprocity. It's based on the fact that they abide by international humanitarian law because that is who they are, and that is the standard that they want to set. Now, so I think as a general point about international humanitarian law, it's not based on sort of what your enemy does. Now, the point about the majority of states, actually what we saw in the CCW 2 weeks ago was that the majority of states were in favour of a legally binding instrument. So it wasn't just a select group. And so I think it is more representative and broader than perhaps might be implied with the question there. The other thing I would say is that the adoption that is already happening of national measures and constraints is fantastic, but this is precisely our argument for elevating it to a shared, a codified constraint in order to have that commonality, to have that more widely binding aspect, and then to, one, create norms, which is what happens with international law, even if ultimately you have, certain actors that do not sign up to certain treaties. This doesn't prevent them from being transformed into what's called customary international humanitarian law, which is binding then regardless of if you have, a few who don't attend. So I think there are a number of ways to sort of counter that argument, and also to say that, this is not unique to this issue and it hasn't stopped the development, the progressive development of international law, and I think the setting of stronger protections across the board.
Thank you. Professor Lubell, no? Lord Fairfax, and then I'll come to Lord Grocott.
I think my question may have sort of been answered already or discussed already, but I'm going to ask it in any event. It's a question about enforceability of regulation. And in view of the comment, Professor Lubell, that you in particular made, you said this is everything's so fast moving in this area. And given the difficulties we have discussed about appropriate definition, and that also, in your view, you said that it is, in your view, it's likely there's going to be a race to the bottom, there's going to be an AI arms race. In view of all those things, I just wanted to ask about the realistic prospect of effective enforceability of regulation. And as I said, Georgia, if I may call you Georgia, has sort of, I think, touched on that already, but I just wanted to hone in on effective. Because if the genie is out of the bottle already, as has been suggested, I think, by Lord Brown, some of these things are right there already, and I'm just concerned about effective enforceability, realistic prospects of effective enforceability.
I suppose it depends if your concern is with enforceability once particular systems are being used and how they're being used, then that would be the same as the problems that we have with all sort of weapon systems and actions in conflict and potential problems that come up that we see in current conflicts now as well around enforceability. But that doesn't mean that we don't try. If you're talking about enforceability in the sense of let's say we try and sort of regulate even the development of certain weapons, but yet some some others will go ahead and use them. I think that is a realistic concern. I think there have been, over the years, over centuries, attempts to prohibit and ban certain weapons completely. Sometimes they've been successful. It's interesting to look at when they've been successful and when not, and some of this is linked to sort of almost at the ethical, moral, social level, if you think about sort of gas and chemical weapons and so on, that seems so utterly abhorrent that it's easier to get that prohibition. I think it's a lot trickier when it comes down to technologies that militaries see as being especially useful. And they are usually less reluctant to agree to a total ban, and so then you try and have sort of regulations on particular types of uses of it. That might be what could be achieved here, but again, I'll just come back to what I was saying earlier, in that I just think I'm not particularly, I don't find it disturbing, other than the problem of admitting that there may be, right now something that isn't regulated, which, as I said, strategically just makes me very, very nervous. And I know in the ICRC, as they've said, they usually don't like to say that either. So it actually means something that in this case they are concerned that the law isn't there. But beyond that, I just think, even if we came up with some kind of new treaty, some kind of new instrument, I just don't see that it would actually solve the problem of how we use these things in practice. We would need still the guidance that we need now on spelling out, as I said, what that means in particular contexts. What does human involvement mean? What does human control mean? It's a phrase that's bandied about, and it's coming into all the various draft instruments, and I'm not sure it would actually even solve the problem.
Maybe Lord Horton, just before I go to Lord Grocott.
Yeah, could I just ask, I don't know the degree to which any or all of you have been exposed to the emerging UK MOD policy on AI and weapon systems, but from everything you've said thus far, as I glance down its headlines, it seems to be fully compliant with all your concerns. The fact that it would be ambitious, safe, responsible, that there is absolutely no intention to deploy fully autonomous weapons, that there will always be the requirement, while technology demands it, that there is a human in the system that is delegated down. So could you comment on the degree to which, and this is contrary to what Georgia was saying about the need for new law, that you think that the emerging UK MOD strategy on the use of AI is accommodating the concerns you have about IHL already, and therefore the residual challenge is more one of how we continue to engage the human dimension of decision making at the appropriate levels.
So, yes, you are entirely correct, and I think from the perspective of the UK as a state with a very active military presence on the world stage, and at the same time a public commitment to IHL, I think the position of the UK, the direction that it's taking, is entirely reasonable. I think the right things are being said. That's not the problem from my perspective. I'm sure colleagues on the panel here might see it differently, but I don't see that as being the issue. For me, again, it's what does this mean in practice? Right? It's just that we keep having, we have general statements about things, but what does that mean? I'm not sure that the work from and obviously there's a lot going on to which I'm not privy, but I'm not entirely convinced that enough work is being done on actually sort of taking this down to the various contexts. I know there are people within the system that are interested in doing that. I've spoken to plenty of them over the last couple of years, and so I think it's spelling out what it means in detail is the problem, not the strategy, not the position, and there are very specific problems that we need to look at. Also, we keep focusing on the use rather than the development. The weapons review process, for example, how does that apply to AI systems? How do you use a weapons review process for software? This is not just about AI; it's about cyber as well. How do you use it when you're examining whether something will be lawful, but the thing you're examining will change constantly afterwards, sometimes even of its own accord? So, at what stage do you need to re-examine its legality and so on? There are complicated questions of how we manage this, but the headline strategy I find to be reasonable, absolutely.
Greycott's been immensely patient.
Yeah.
I get to go to him now.
Well, I've been patient, Chairman, not least. Well, it's been extremely interesting, but also because of a lot of the area that's covered by the question that I'm about to ask has been touched on, well, quite frequently, actually. But by the way, I've got no relevant interest to declare on this. But in listening carefully to everything that's been said, I'm slightly alarmed in terms of our report as and when it is produced, because we've heard that it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, or maybe unnecessary, to define what AWS is, which is a bit worrying if that's what we're looking into. And the other thing that I'm aware of is that it was Georgia Hines that said this, that so much of this is about hypotheticals. And one thing that politicians can't spend too much time discussing is hypotheticals. You've actually got to make laws or participate in the making of laws. So my question as it stands is, are there circumstances in which AWS could improve compliance with international humanitarian law? Now, that's been answered in part already, but because of my desire to get my feet, if no one else is, back on the ground and away from the ether, could I ask of specific examples where AWS could improve compliance with international humanitarian law? And perhaps specifically to Georgia Hines, who I found very, very interesting what you had to say about possible new laws. The new laws, as you spelt them out, potential new laws that you spelt out, would those prohibit any activities that are going on at present, leaving aside for a moment how you define AWS? And can we just try and get it down in terms of specifics? Those are my two questions.
Very good.
All right, Georgia Hines.
Thank you. All right, I will jump in there. So in terms of specific examples providing greater IHL compliance, I honestly cannot give you any within our definition. So I think I can definitely give you many that are currently being used that improve military advantage, and that, these kind of air defense systems that operate beyond the speed of humans. I can absolutely see the military advantage there. And we would say they are currently being used within IHL constraints, based on those limits around the types of targets, the limited scope of time and duration, geographic scope, all these kinds of things. So with those existing systems, we would say they are, by and large, from what we know, based on open source information, being used in compliance with IHL. And that is where we've drawn the recommendations for our limitations on use from. As for whether our recommendations would then prohibit any current activities, again, we're a little bit limited in our information because obviously even with the ICRC, states don't always want to share exactly the extent of their capabilities. And where we are really running into problems with this is there are technologies that operate on a continuum. So they're either remotely piloted, they're sort of drone technologies, with the capability to operate in an autonomous mode, but we don't know whether they are being operated in that autonomous mode. And I'm thinking particularly in current conflicts, there are loitering munitions. So these are sort of, they look like drones, and essentially they're sometimes called suicide drones, will hover over a target and then dive and self-destruct. Now, we're seeing potential that these are being used against human targets. It's unclear whether they are being used in an autonomous mode or based on existing remotely controlled technologies. And for us, this is a key consideration. And so it makes it difficult to answer your question as to whether our recommendations would extend to that. But certainly, if these were being used as autonomous weapons, and were being used against humans, then that would be captured by our prohibition recommendation. The others, so the prohibition on unpredictable systems is designed to more capture the future technologies where there are greater integration of machine learning, systems that change their functioning after use that Noam was talking about, that put them beyond that human ability to predict the effects. Swarm technologies are another one where at the moment they're being run as remotely piloted. The more autonomous they become, they start to produce emergent behaviours. They could run into becoming an unpredictable system within our definition. But on existing use, we've tried to base it so that it doesn't actually constrain or prohibit things that are already in use and that are already being used in compliance with IHL.
Thank you. Our other two panelists, do you want to add to that?
Sure, I guess very briefly, I think hypotheticals are really the problem, and I think that's why focusing on the decision-making process itself is really useful, because it gives you a concrete way to think about the issues that arise. I think one of the issues is maybe that we're operating under a slightly different definition, and I think when I'm thinking of the issue, it's more thinking of how AI is used and how it can benefit rather than a fully autonomous system that exists on its own. And I think if an AI system is used, there are a number of different ways where it could contribute to better compliance with IHL. I think the ability to model predicted consequences is a really good example, where you can use a system to model the likely effects of an attack, and to draw on past history, to draw on the contextual environments, maybe the makeup of a building, to bring a lot more intelligence to play to understand what the consequences will be.
Can I just ask whether anything is being developed along those lines? You're in the hypotheticals now, but is there a manufacturer somewhere in Britain who's working on that kind of equipment that you're envisaging?
I mean, there are projects being worked on with regard to identification of objects, for example, in a military context. Absolutely, there are projects, and there's public knowledge of some of these projects that are being done. So for example, if these systems would be better at identifying things than the current systems that we've got, identifying what is military and what is civilian. Now, I'm not saying that they are, right? But again, if you talk about possibilities, I do think it's possible that you could have systems that would have advantages also on the humanitarian side. Again, as I mentioned earlier, there's a flip side to it, because when, for example, you can be more accurate and only target the military, because IHL allows some proportionate damage, you could end up targeting something that beforehand you wouldn't have targeted, because there would be too much collateral harm. Now you can target it with a small amount of collateral harm, and so therefore for those people that are in that small amount of collateral harm, they've actually now suffered when beforehand the thing next to them wouldn't have been targeted at all because we didn't have anything accurate enough. So there's a flip side to this, but I don't think, for me, I don't think I could just say there'll never be an advantage. Absolutely there could be, but it also depends on the definitions. So if your definitional starting point is these systems are systems that do all these kind of unlawful things, then of course you're not going to have an example of a positive use of these systems, because you've defined them as something negative. So it comes back to how we define them in the first place. I think it's important to note, and I hesitate to remind the committee, but of the title for this committee is not autonomous weapon systems, it's artificial intelligence in weapon systems, right? So in that sense, you have, I would presume, from your own title, you have the mandate to think about things a little differently, and not just, how do we define autonomous systems the way it's being discussed at the CCW, but to look more widely at the use of artificial intelligence across the weapon systems and the targeting cycle. And someone chose that title for a reason, I hope, and not just randomly.
I think that's advice very well taken, Professor. What I'd like to do is come to Lord Hamilton for a moment, and then, with Lord Brown's permission, postpone the questions about international fora, because I think we might combine those two questions, and bring in the Bishop on the issue of accountability. So, Lord Hamilton.
Thank you so much, Lord Chairman. It strikes me that we've got an enormous problem if we bring the law into this, because we can't actually define what we're trying to ban. Surely we should be... I mean, the great advantage of all of this is that we're talking about military structures, and they're sort of the ideal pyramid, aren't they? They have General Horton at the top and everybody else all the way down. Surely we should be looking to... the responsibility should lie with the military commanders and what actually happens with a weapon system, whether it's AI or not, and place the responsibility within the military structure. And to that extent, you bring the human element into it, rather than try and ban certain activities. Would you agree with that, Professor Lewis?
Professor.
So, yes, I think accountability is one of the biggest issues that keeps coming up and gives rise to the most concern. I think pretty much everyone would agree that we cannot have systems in use for which there is no accountability. I mean, that's, you know, I think that's a basic starting point that nobody would dispute. I think part of the problem with the discussion around accountability goes back to something I mentioned earlier about the conflation of general AI and narrow AI, and these being tools and not agents. Right? Nobody's talking about, oh, how do we hold a machine accountable? We're not going to hold a machine accountable because, you know, again, this is not general AI. Maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but that's not the kind of speculation we're engaging with in these debates. So then we're talking about a weapon system. And if it's a weapon system, then accountability, I would argue the problem has perhaps been made to seem more complicated than it is, because accountability can be determined the same way it is with any other weapon system. And it's not, again, a one-size-fits-all, because it depends what went wrong. So if you use an AI-driven weapon system and something happens that looks like it may have been a violation of IHL, well, you need to investigate what happened. Right? You know, starting point. And there's an obligation to investigate, and then you investigate. If it turns out that a commander deployed this system in a manner that was against the rules, did it, for example, intently to harm civilians, or just as operating instructions, and knowingly used it in violation of those, then you can have responsibility of the commander for that. If the weapon is deployed in accordance with its operating instructions, with all the right intentions, and yet something still happened, then again we do the investigation to figure out what that was. It could be a mechanical failure. We straight away go to the problem with the algorithms, but it could also be a loose wire. Right, in these systems. You need to look at that. These things happen with other weapon systems as well, and we have mechanisms for dealing with that. If we can't find a mechanical problem and we don't know what happened and it's something to do with the algorithms driving it, again, the investigation continues. If it's a system where we can understand, and the black box is a problem, but it's not a problem with every single system. And it's particularly with neural networks, deep learning, and so on, but not always. So you investigate, you look at also the computing side of it, and if you can figure out what went wrong, you look to see if it was a problem in the design of it, you look to see if it encountered something it never encountered, and you can try and understand and rectify that. If, after looking at it, you still can't figure out what went wrong, and you have this explainability problem in the black box and you can't figure out why it did it, then you take the weapon out of use. You don't use a weapon that would be, unpredictable, that causes these problems. And if a commander or a military more generally continues to use a weapon knowing it malfunctions and we don't know why it malfunctions, then there's accountability for that as well, as there is with using any weapon knowingly that could be malfunctioning. So I think we can find solutions to the accountability problem along those lines more generally. On top of which, that's a focus on individual accountability. We also need to remember that international humanitarian law is a branch of public international law, and there is always state responsibility, regardless of what we find or don't find with individual accountability.
Dr. Murray and Georgia Hines, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think just very briefly, I'd agree with the distinction between general AI and narrow AI. I think just to remind that AI tools are complex systems, but they're made up of different components, and each component has a task. And I think when we're thinking about accountability, we need to look at those different components. Have they been designed and developed in a way that they're capable of achieving that task, and then are they deployed in a manner consistent with that task? So, are they deployed in line with their intended circumstances of use or outside of it? And I think once we break down the AI lifecycle in that way, it becomes much easier to think about attributing accountability and responsibility, because everybody has a role in the system. In some instances, it'll be within the military, it might be as part of a corporation, if tools are used from outside, but then it's just understanding what the responsibility or what the component is intended to do at each part of the life cycle.
Roger Hines.
Just quickly on this point. So I think a lot of our concerns around accountability mirror our concerns at the front end. And this is where our prohibition on unpredictable systems plays a role, because I think, and Noam has brought this out well, about the black box effect. It doesn't appear with all systems, but for those systems where it does appear, I think we have a real fundamental issue, because for individual criminal responsibility, most legal systems require intent. They require a certain mens rea. Now, if you have a system that is producing its own results outside of or continuing to learn, and it might not be a malfunction, it might be what the system views as an optimization, but it produces a result that is beyond a human intent, then you have a real fundamental break with individual criminal responsibility. I think you will hear, in your next session from Vincent from CIPRI, and they have done some very good work, in particular around accountability and responsibility, so they could speak much more eloquently on this. But they've brought out issues around traceability, and that means the ability to trace the operation, the performance, the effect of a weapon back to a human developer and a user. And I think there are specifics around autonomous weapon systems that don't arise with other weapons. The other thing that they have suggested is having, in contrast to other weapons, having a specific deemed scheme of responsibility for those who are involved in the development and use of autonomous weapons. And I think this comes out a bit in Annex C in the ambitious, safe, responsible approach. So it says that the UK will clearly establish authorities, so accountability and responsibility, whenever UK forces deploy weapon systems with AI. And so there's a question there about whether that needs to be sort of AWS specific with deemed responsibility on certain operators where you can't otherwise trace back intention and things like that. Whether that's fair and whether that's something that military users would accept is a separate question, but that's a proposal that's been put forward as well.
Bishop of Coventry.
Thank you, Lord Chair. I think my question has been largely, addressed over accountability, but just to press it a little bit more, and then if I may ask a slightly sort of wider question that I think is related. I suppose it's to do with the question, well, it's a number of things. First, whether these methods of accountability are going to suffice for the future. Now, that's such a difficult question, but I think Lord Brown makes a very important point, and Professor Lebel, you did at the beginning, about the pace of change, and in a sense, trying to think ahead. So that's one aspect. Are the accountability systems that you're talking about, are they going to last? The other, and maybe this is moving more into an observation, but a sort of interesting tension that I think has been evident in this fascinating session and is relevant as Darren Murray has pointed out to our whole task, is I hear Georgia Hines talking about a specificity about autonomous weapons that moves things into a different realm, ethically and legally, than the AI that you are, quite rightly saying we must attend to AI across the system. If I may add in the sort of supplementary to that, I hear from Georgia Hines that the specificity of lethal or autonomous weapons does touch upon a fundamental ethical issue of killing not being franchised to machines. And I just wondered whether you had any reflections on that fundamental issue, and whether that is something that needs to be addressed by our thinking. I'm conscious of that expression, law is the hard edge of ethics, if I've got that right. You know, it's not unrelated to ethics, it's where it sort of comes down to the realities.
Who's going to, that's a challenging brief, who's going to try have a go at unpacking it? Professor.
So just first on the accountability and keeping up, we will need to keep up, but that doesn't mean that it can't be done. Again, so long as we're sticking with narrow AI systems, as long as we haven't moved into the realm of systems that set their own tasks, right, and then go about achieving them, then we should be, I mean, the weapons will get more the systems will get more sophisticated, and we'll need to keep updating our operating instructions and the understanding for everyone in the field that's using them at every single stage, you know, what that means and what, when and how they can be used and when not, and what the risks are. But we'll need to keep doing that. But as long as we do, then the same basic accountability mechanisms, I think, should be in place. In terms of the specificity of these systems, well, I mean, again, for me, it's less about the autonomy; it's more about the AI. And I keep coming back to, and I think you know, Dara's been saying this as well. I am just as much, if not more, concerned by AI being used in the early intelligence analysis stages that then feeds into something that we think is completely done by humans, but is actually all based on information that was put together by AI. And the two of us, together with a colleague from the US, Ashley Deeks, a few years ago, published a paper where we looked at the risks of having some of these AI systems being used in intelligence analysis for what we call the jus ad bellum, the decisions to go to war, you know, self-defense, right? Because, I mean, ultimately, the grander decisions, we're sitting here talking about what might happen, you know, in a particular military attack that involves a total of, you know, 50 people or something. But what happens when our intelligence analysis systems and wargaming, I mean, wargaming has been done using computers for many, many years. It gets more and more sophisticated. Our decision to actually go to war in the first place is based to a large part on intelligence analysis done by AI systems. You know, but we're not really talking about that. You know, but it's so the AI being used in intelligence analysis and so on, I think, is just as worrying. And so for me, it's less about the autonomy; it's more about the AI. And as far as the ethical questions, they're huge. They are, absolutely, and I don't deny any of them, and I agree with a lot of, you know, and some of the concerns raised by the ICRC and others around the ethical side of things. Absolutely, these are concerns. You know, I separate between can we use these things lawfully or not with existing law, and then questions of ethics. But the issue of AI determining life and death decisions is not unique to military contexts. Right? So self-driving cars were mentioned earlier, and the old-fashioned, it's almost, you know, a little cliche to use it in some of these debates, but the old-fashioned philosophical trolley problem, right? If you apply it with a self-driving car, and you've got a car that needs to decide, you know, now there's only two options left because of an oncoming truck, and do I go up on the pavement and run over these two people, or stay on the road and let the passenger be killed? And the car's going to have to make that decision, although I hesitate to use decision in the context of AI. But, you know, these are life and death situations that AI systems are going to do. On a larger scale, traffic management systems being done by AI is going to be, you know, determining for many countries a lot more life and death situations than any military AI, and that's without speaking about AI in health contexts and in other contexts. So AI is coming into critical life and death decisions across every realm of society, and I am actually concerned that we keep trying to debate it within the military context as if this is something separate and unique And we end up having a different relationship to AI in the military context as we do in others, when that same AI system or a different version of it will make life and death decisions or execute life and death functions regularly in other realms. And I think we've not got enough joined up thinking in that sense. The people debating it here need to be talking to the people debating it there. This is much bigger about human-machine interaction and how we incorporate AI into our society across all realms. And that's where we need to be having these big debates. And then they can feed back down into the military side and into everywhere else. We need to understand ethically what our relationship is going to be with AI, and then think, okay, what does that mean for the military? What does that mean for law enforcement? What does that mean in the health sector? And then we might think different things. But I'm concerned that we're having sort of these big AI ethics debate in narrow silos rather than joined up thinking.
Thank you.
Dara Murray and Georgia Hines, do you have anything to add to that?
I think I'll be very brief. I think for the foreseeable future, we will be talking about narrow AI, and so we will be talking about systems that operate within human-defined parameters. So the accountability processes we're talking about will be appropriate. Excuse me. I think my bigger concern is with the use of AI in intelligence decision making, because intelligence should hopefully pervade everything that the military does, whereas the targeting or the actual engagement is, a relatively small part. So I think that it has potentially bigger impacts on both the military and the humanitarian components than just the specific engagement of targets. And ethics is way beyond my pay grade, I think. But I think the point about healthcare in particular is really well made.
Georgia Hines.
Look, just to reiterate some of the points, on accountability, I think, yes, we have existing systems for individual and for state responsibility. These will continue to operate, but with autonomous systems, even if we're talking about existing systems, you can still have, at the moment they are, say, for instance, particularly vulnerable to adversarial conditions, so particularly vulnerable to enemy interference or spoofing, as they call it. Now, if this produces unforeseen results, who are we tracing that back to? So I think it does actually bring in some different considerations for accountability. We can talk about programmers and, if there's a malfunction in the code, that's a programmer responsibility. But the reality when we talk to programmers is it's actually very complex, even in narrow AI, and that they're not just, it's one programmer responsible for the whole piece of code. It's actually a far more complex and a process that involves many, many people who might only see a narrow part of the development and then the ultimate system. Then it's very, very difficult to have that traceability, which is something that CIPRI has said specifically needs to be looked at for autonomous systems.
Thank you very much. I think Lord Brown has got some questions on international fora we've been touching on in the course of the morning, unless all your questions have been answered, Lord Brown.
Well, they've all been touched on. I think we should at least tell our witnesses that we've got the message about having a broader look at this than only in relation to autonomous weapon systems. It's undoubtedly the case that AI is used in intelligence, reconnaissance and surveillance, and the reporting of it is correct. It's being used in Ukraine significantly to effect. So I think it would be a mistake if we didn't touch on that. But defence and security is special and different because we train people to exercise lethal force on other human beings. And we do that to a limited extent in our domestic security, but we do it it's at the heart of what we do when we create our military capabilities. So it is special, and I actually don't make any apology for finding myself in the same space as the international community has in the autonomous weapon system and in the issue of the interface between humans and machines in decision making about the use of lethal, because that's where the international community got itself. It went to this inappropriately named convention on certain, whatever it is, well, its full title is the Convention on Prohibitions or Restrictions on the Use of Certain Conventional Weapons, and this is important, which may be deemed to be excessively injurious or of indiscriminate effects. So we went there, and I think we went there because of a 100 years history of arms control. So I don't think this. I mean, this issue is a discussion about international humanitarian law, but it actually de facto is about arms control and whether we can, as we have done with many other weapons that were subject to international humanitarian law and could be deployed consistently with international humanitarian law, and come out of that discussion saying we will not use them. Right. And we're being encouraged also as legislators by many of the people who have been responsible for the development of AI enabling weapon systems potentially to say don't do it. Right. So these questions really are. I mean, are we in the right place in doing that, or are there alternatives? Is that likely to be successful? And if it's not likely to be successful, why is it not going to be successful about these weapon systems when it has been with a whole list of others that we're able to identify? You know, and in particular, I'm interested in the United Kingdom's position in relation to this and your comments on that. I mean, this has been an extraordinarily rich session for us, so I'm happy to. I think maybe I might start with Georgia Hines in this case and come to you, gentlemen.
Georgia Hines.
Thanks very much for the very difficult question on where do we go from here, essentially. So, yeah, I mean, 2 weeks ago, I've sat through the discussions in the CCW, but this has been going on for nearly 10 years without reaching consensus on the best ways to address many of the risks that we've been talking about today. I think, you know, we were encouraged in those discussions to see there have been constructive moves. We are talking about substance, and there are an increasing number of states that clearly recognise the risks, recognise what's being called this two-tier approach of prohibitions on certain AWS, restrictions on the remainder, recognise that there are, you know, pragmatic, principled ways to articulate those limits. But having said all that, of course, there are still challenges within the CCW, and I think a lot will depend on the next few months as the chair works towards a report. I think for us, the bigger picture is the momentum towards regulation, and that includes discussions occurring in other forums, including with the UN General Assembly First Committee, with the resolution of 70 states last year, which the UK joined. The Human Rights Council is discussing it with a new advisory committee looking at new technologies broadly, but with a strong focus on autonomous weapons. So we think that the CCW remains, you know, a strong fora that we will continue a forum to engage in. And in terms of its history, it does have a very good track record that can be drawn on. So for instance, you know, the protocol on the use of mines and booby traps, the amended protocol 2, which ultimately, you know, then led to an anti-personnel mine ban convention as well, which coming back to one of the earlier points that were made about, well, what's the point if we don't have all states joining this? Not all states are party to the anti-personnel mine ban convention, for instance. That's not to say it's not effective. It's not to say that the UK doesn't say it's effective either. And similarly with a lot of these protocols under the CCW. So on blinding laser weapons, this was one of the first that we saw that was a prohibition on a use of a weapon against persons. So, you know, this provides us with a good precedent when we're talking about autonomous weapons. So I'm afraid I can't give you a good answer about why we were able to achieve it more quickly with these other ones than with autonomous weapons. But I hope that we can be optimistic. And at least, as I said, you know, there are discussions occurring in other forums, because I think it's good to have, you know, multidisciplinary, it's good to have different considerations of the issue being looked at, and maybe not to be so narrow. So.
Thank you. Professor Lubell.
I think it's, you can never rule anything out, but I don't think it's particularly likely we'll see a new instrument, a binding instrument, come out of the CCW for reasons already previously stated. Other forums may pick this up, and some are already, including, by the way, I don't think we mentioned regional forums. You know, you could end up seeing, and there are discussions happening as well, that there may be things happening at that level. But what will we actually end up with? Let's say we did end up with something, whether CCW or elsewhere. What would it actually say? I think, you're not going to end up with sort of total ban on using AI because it's just too useful, and states are too concerned over others using it, and I don't think we can equate it to some other things that have been completely banned. So we're talking about regulations on use that we might end up with. And I just don't see how anything in an instrument form would get into much more detail than what we're already seeing come out in things like whether it's the statement by the UK and the US or the ICRC position, and they're actually not as far apart as you might think. There's a lot of common ground there in terms of accepting the need for human control, human involvement, accountability. Everyone's accepting all of this, but at the instrument level, it stays very generalized. And so I would just remain with the concern that really what's missing is the detailed guidance, is the unpacking. Is, when we talk about, okay, yes, we all agree there needs to be accountability. Okay, how's that going to work? Right, spell it out. Give details of how accountability is going to work. Context-appropriate human involvement. What does that mean? What does it mean in this context? What does it mean in that context? What does it mean for intel? What does it mean for targeting? Right? For this technology, what does it mean for that technology? And without that, it's for me, it's not so much a question of can we get an instrument, can't we get an instrument. It's what's this instrument actually going to do, unless we have the more in-depth discussion and guidance.
Dr. Murray.
Yeah, very quickly. I think the in-depth guidance is really key, and I think the other elements that might be useful is to think through a framework about how we approach the decision making. So something that will set out the types of issues that should be taken into consideration, the hurdles that might be overcome, that kind of more practical guidance, but potentially at an international level, might be really useful because it might allow us to go more in-depth on specific issues.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to draw proceedings to a close now. I think the three of you have had the great achievement this morning, first of all, of answering a dazzling array of questions in a way that I think we found hugely helpful, but second, also in the process adding substantially to the committee's agenda. So I think on both counts we are extremely grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you.